Today we're tackling just one word, but what a word. It's packed with history, layers of meaning. We're exploring ennui.
Ah, ennui. Yeah, that just sounds French, doesn't it, right off the bat?
It absolutely is French. The sources are clear. It's a direct borrowing. And the history, the etymology, is pretty fascinating.
Okay.
It traces back to Old French ennui, which meant annoyance or weariness.
Annoyance, weariness. That feels maybe a little lighter than how we think of ennui now, like just being a bit bothered.
It does, initially, but the sources show it goes much, much deeper. That Old French word, ennui, it came from late Latin, in odiare.
Inudia.
Yeah, meaning to make loathsome. And that comes from the Latin phrase in odio.
In odio. Like in hatred? Hated.
Exactly. Hated. You can even see the line right there connecting to our word annoy.
Wow. Okay, hated, loathsome. That puts a completely different weight on it. That's much heavier than just, being bored. Intense.
It is intense. And that deep feeling, that's really central, especially in French literature. The sources make a point that in French, ennui isn't just simple boredom. It's often much bigger.
Bigger how?
Like a real sense of detachment from society, maybe. A feeling of stagnation, being weary of, well, maybe everything, everyone. It's hard to nail down with just one English word.
Right, so it's this very specific feeling. Do other languages have terms for something similar?
They do, yeah. The material we looked at lists quite a few. There's the Italian noia. German has Weltschmerz, that kind of world weariness or angst, that deep dread. Latin had acedia, a sort of spiritual apathy. Russian has Tosca, this deep aching sadness. And Turkish huzun, which is complex, like melancholy mixed with loss.
So it's definitely not just a French thing. It's a human thing expressed differently.
Yeah, exactly. A widely recognized feeling.
So when we do try to capture it in English, what words come closest according to the sources?
Well, there are several related ones listed. Boredom, obviously, but also lassitude, world weariness, malaise, melancholy, alienation, even anomie, that feeling of normlessness.
Okay.
One source mentions Merriam-Webster has a long list of synonyms, and Wiktionary defines it as, and this gets closer to that deeper feeling, gripping listlessness or melancholia caused by boredom, depression.
Gripping listlessness. Yeah, that sounds more like it. More than just being bored, it connects back to that hated root somehow.
Right. It often implies something heavier, more oppressive.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Given that heavy origin, the complex French meaning, how did this word ennui actually make its way into English? How did we adopt it?
Well, that's a really interesting part of the story in the sources. English was actually pretty slow to grab onto a specific word for this feeling, even though the feeling itself must have been around. Yeah, John Evelyn pointed this out way back in 1667. He noted that English lacks certain words, and specifically mentioned things like ennui.
Huh. That is surprising. We didn't have a good word for that kind of deep weariness or detachment.
Not one single common term, no. I mean, think about it. The sources point out that related words like bore, the verb, didn't even show up in writing until, 1776?
Wow, that late.
Yeah, and boring or boredom came even later, mid-19th century. So ennui was known before that, but mostly just by people who knew French, who read French literature.
So people were reading it in French, but maybe struggling to translate it.
That's exactly it. Early English dictionaries or grammars that tried to define ennui used a whole mix of terms. Things like weariness, uneasiness, sometimes even despairing. They were trying to get at the nuance.
Trying to find the right English fit for this very specific first actual use.
The earliest naturalized use they found in an English text was apparently 1749. An editor talking about writing poetry to avoid ennui. So yeah, started out a bit literary.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Once it arrived, once people started using it more, how did they understand ennui in, say, 18th century England? Because it sounds like the meaning wasn't fixed.
No, definitely not fixed. The sources painted as a pretty fluid concept back then, and it was very often linked, deeply linked, to time, specifically to being bored because of time.
Time itself? How so?
Like having too much time with nothing to fill it, or just experiencing time as dragging incredibly slowly. There's an example from a novel, Columella, from 1779.
Yeah.
The character links ennui directly to having too much time, finding reading insipid, finding amusements insipid, literally counting the hours between meals. It's that mix, temporal boredom, but also this kind of existential flatness.
So maybe not always the super heavy literary soul-crushing ennui we might associate with, like, Baudelaire later on.
Not always, no. The
Okay.
sources definitely show it could just be simpler, temporary weariness. It even pops up in comedies.
Really? In comedies?
Yeah, which suggests it wasn't always seen as this profound crisis state for everyone. Sometimes it was just caused by boring people.
Huh. Okay, that's relatable.
Totally. The material mentions complaints like, oh, the bore, or someone saying they were dying with ennui whenever he spoke. Lawrence Stern complained about feeling ennui in France because of the, quote, eternal platitude of French characters.
Ouch. So a link to just simple boredom, dull company, that seems clear. And it was becoming a bit fashionable, too.
It was, yeah. By the 1770s, it was often understood pretty simply as boredom. And kind of amusingly, it got tagged as this fashionable ailment of the rich elite, the bon ton.
Ah, the bon ton.
Which, of course, made it a perfect target for satire, mockery in essays, plays,
A disease of the idle rich. Nothing new there, I guess.
pretty much. But then here's where it gets even more, well, striking. You look at what the medical writers were saying.
Medical writers. About ennui.
Yes. One source highlights a writer named Crichton in 1798. He described ennui as an irksomeness of mind. And he specifically said it was caused by the slowness of time.
Irksomeness of mind. Okay.
Yeah. But he didn't stop there. He linked this feeling, this ennui, to potentially sudden irrational actions. He even considered it a form of mental derangement.
Mental derangement. Whoa, okay. That takes it way beyond just being bored or fashionable. That's pathological.
Exactly. For doctors like Crichton, it wasn't just a feeling. It could be a serious condition. And the sources draw a line from that 18th century view to later understandings that linked ennui even more directly with disease, with moral crisis, and even, tragically, with suicide.
Wow.
It was described, in some contexts, as something capable of killing not only the body but also the soul. That's a pretty stark image.
That's incredibly powerful and unsettling. So who was typically seen as suffering from this foul fiend, as one source apparently called it? And what were the causes? How did people try to avoid it?
Right, the foul fiend. The material we read is pretty consistent here. In 18th century England, ennui was really strongly associated with social rank, with lifestyle, meaning it was seen as mainly plaguing the wealthy, the elite, the people with too much unstructured time on their hands.
So too much leisure time was the danger zone.
That was often the perception, yeah. And interestingly, the countryside was often seen as a breeding ground for it.
The countryside, not the busy city.
Maybe counterintuitive, right? But the idea was, for the leisured class, there was lack of stimulating entertainment, a lack of good company out there. Novels use this metaphor of a vegetative existence to describe the dullness.
The vegetative existence. Ouch.
Yeah. But dull company wasn't just a rural problem. You could find that anywhere. Even being surrounded by pleasure in the city wasn't a guarantee against ennui if the people were boring.
Right. Was it seen as affecting men more or women more? Was there a gender aspect?
That's a really interesting point from the sources. For the specific 18th century English context they examined, ennui was not clearly gendered.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Both men and women are shown suffering from it. Both are advised on how to avoid it. And both could be accused of being boring and causing ennui in others.
Huh. That's actually surprising. You might expect it to be portrayed differently.
Right. It pushes back a bit on some later historical takes. So, yeah, pretty equal opportunity suffering, apparently.
Okay, so if everyone could get it, what were the recommended cures? What did the sources say about fighting off this irksomeness of mind?
Well, they listed several things seen as good antidotes. Reading was a big one, physical exercise, and dedicated study, especially things like letters and science.
Study as a cure.
Yeah, study was seen as really important, almost a moral good. Hannah More called it a specific relief against that mental disease. The idea was it helps you use time productively, you see, instead of just trying to kill time.
There's that time connection again. Killing time. That phrase itself says a lot.
It really does. It keeps coming up. Other remedies involve pleasure, anything seen as dispeller of care.
Like what kind of pleasure?
Things like good conversation, visiting friends, going for walks. Basically any purposeful activity. Useful stuff, or just entertaining things that filled time in a meaningful, engaging way.
Made time feel full instead of empty.
Exactly. And a few sources also suggested religious belief could help prevent it, giving life a purpose beyond just filling the hours.
And that really intense quote you mentioned before.
Oh, right. Lord Monboddo. One source quotes him calling ennui that foul fiend and a disease of our mind or better part.
Strong words.
Very. He saw it as the root cause of vice and foolishness for people who didn't know how to use their leisure well. He thought it made people do anything rather than do nothing, just desperate to escape the feeling. So if we step back a bit from just the 18th century, the philosophical material we looked at really shows this whole idea of boredom, ennui, weariness. It's not new. It could actually be a functional emotion.
Functional how? Like an alarm bell.
Kind of, yeah. A signal that maybe we need more engagement, something new, maybe a clearer goal. It's like our mind saying, hey, find something more stimulating or meaningful.
Okay. So if you had to pull it all together, what's the main takeaway from this whole deep dive into ennui based on everything we read?
I think what comes through consistently across all the sources is that ennui, whatever we call it, is fundamentally tied to our experience of time, our level of engagement with the world,
Right.
and that search for meaning.
Time, engagement, meaning.
Yeah. The sources show it wasn't seen as trivial back then. It was linked to lifestyle, to morality, even, as we saw, to physical and mental health. It's that feeling that arises when time feels slow, empty, maybe even, going back to the root, loathsome.
Right.
It's not just about having nothing to do. It's more like feeling that nothing you could do feels worthwhile or engaging enough.
Wow. This has been genuinely fascinating. Tracing this single word from those intense Latin roots, watching it arrive in English, seeing how its meaning shifted and was debated in 18th century society and medicine, and then connecting it to these bigger philosophical questions.
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
if we take that idea seriously from the sources, the idea that maybe ennui or boredom is a kind of signal.
A signal about how we're using our time.
Exactly. A signal that maybe we're not engaging fully or maybe we're feeling a lack of purpose.
Right.
Then it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What might those moments of irksomeness of mind, that tedious pain, or even just that feeling of time dragging, what might those moments be telling you about your own engagement and maybe what you need right now?